World War II did not end because humanity suddenly remembered its conscience. It ended because one side ran out of soldiers, supplies, and territory before the other did. What remained afterward was not a moral reckoning, but a scramble to decide which crimes would be prosecuted and which would be filed away. The war everyone thinks they understand, the one with clear sides and obvious villains, functioned because thousands of ordinary institutions made decisions that were legal, documented and approved by committees. This is about the practices that were never supposed to be discussed after the surrender documents were signed. These were not the actions of madmen acting alone. They were policies refined through repetition, embedded in bureaucracy, and normalized to the point where objection became the exception rather than the rule. The Allied forces maintained what were officially termed segregated blood banks throughout the entire war. The American Red Cross, operating under military guidelines, separated blood donations by race. Blood drawn from black donors was labeled and stored separately from blood drawn from white donors. This was not an accident of poor record-keeping. It was an institutionalized medical policy. The separation was maintained even though the science of the time clearly demonstrated that blood types, not racial categories, determined compatibility. The man who pioneered blood plasma storage, Charles Drew, was himself black, and he opposed the policy in writing. He was overruled. Wounded soldiers received transfusions based on paperwork that prioritized racial classification over medical need. Men bled out in field hospitals while compatible blood sat unused because it came from donors whose skin was the wrong color. The policy was defended in official correspondence as necessary to maintain morale among white troops who might refuse treatment if they knew the blood came from black donors. This continued until 1945. The practice was not banned due to moral outcry. It was quietly discontinued after the war, when it became inconvenient to defend in public. But the records of how many soldiers died due to delayed or refused transfusions based on racial blood labeling were never compiled into an official report. Japan operated what it called the Kwantung Army's Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department in occupied Manchuria, known more commonly as Unit 731. This was not a secret in the sense that it was hidden from the military command structure. It operated with full institutional backing, budgets, personnel transfers, and supply requisitions processed through official channels. The unit conducted experiments on live human subjects, referred to in internal documents as logs, to test the effects of biological agents, frostbite, vivisection without anesthesia, and pressure chamber exposure. The subjects were prisoners, many of them Chinese civilians, Soviet soldiers, and Korean independence fighters. The work was methodical. Researchers published internal papers. Photographs were taken for documentation. Data was recorded in logs and filed. After the war, American occupation authorities granted immunity to the physicians and researchers in exchange for the biological warfare data they had compiled. No member of Unit 731 was tried at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. The deal was arranged by American military intelligence, which classified the research and integrated it into U.S. biological weapons programs. The Soviet Union conducted their own war crimes trial in 1949 for a handful of lower-ranked Unit 731 personnel they had captured. But the lead scientists were by then living under American protection. The research data was never released to the public, and the families of the victims were not informed that the people responsible had been granted immunity in exchange for paperwork. The British government maintained a policy referred to internally as the Bengal Priority Scheme during the 1943 famine in India. When rice production in Burma was lost to Japanese occupation, Bengal faced a shortfall. The British War Cabinet, chaired by Winston Churchill, decided that available food stocks and transportation resources would be diverted to support the war effort in Europe and the Mediterranean, rather than alleviating the famine. Grain continued to be exported from India even as rural Bengalis starved. Requests from the Viceroy of India for emergency food shipments were denied or delayed. Churchill's private secretary recorded minutes from meetings where the Prime Minister questioned why Gandhi had not yet died if the famine was as serious as reported. Official estimates placed the death toll at over 2 million, though some studies suggest the number was closer to 3 million. The policy was framed as a wartime necessity. Shipping was needed for military operations. Food was a strategic resource to be allocated where it provided maximum utility to the Allied cause. The famine was not classified as a genocide because it was the result of prioritization rather than intent to destroy a specific group, and this distinction allowed it to be documented in war records without triggering legal consequences. After independence, the Indian government requested access to the full correspondence and cabinet meeting notes related to the famine response. The British government declined and kept the majority of the records sealed under official secrecy laws. The United States government operated 10 major war relocation centers between 1942 and 1945, imprisoning approximately 120,000 people of Japanese descent, the majority of whom were American citizens. The incarceration was authorized by Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin Roosevelt. There was no trial, no formal accusation, and no evidence of espionage or sabotage required. The order classified an entire ethnic group as a potential security threat based solely on ancestry. Families were given as little as 48 hours to sell their homes, businesses, and possessions before being transported to camps surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers in remote desert locations. The camps were administered by the War Relocation Authority, a civilian agency that maintained records of every internee, tracked their labor assignments, and required loyalty oaths before release was considered. The internees were used as agricultural labor. They grew food that was sold commercially while receiving minimal compensation. Some young men in the camps were later recruited into military service and sent to fight in Europe, even while their families remained imprisoned. The legal framework justifying the incarceration was upheld by the Supreme Court in Korematsu versus United States. That decision was not formally repudiated until 2018. The government issued a formal apology in 1988 and provided monetary reparations to surviving internees, but this came only after decades of silence and required sustained political pressure from Japanese-American advocacy groups. The camps were not referred to as concentration camps in official wartime documents, even though that is the term that accurately described their function. German pharmaceutical companies, including Bayer and Hoechst, used concentration camp prisoners as test subjects for experimental drugs. The companies submitted requests to the SS for specific numbers of subjects, specifying gender, age, and health status required for the trials. The requests were processed as standard procurement forms. The prisoners were injected with untested compounds, infected with diseases to observe the effects of medications, and subjected to surgeries without consent. Those who died during the experiments were cremated, and the results were recorded in corporate research files. After the war, some of the scientists involved were tried at Nuremberg in the doctor's trial, but the pharmaceutical companies themselves were not dismantled. They were allowed to continue operating. Bayer, which had been part of the IG Farben conglomerate during the war, resumed business and became one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. IG Farben was broken up by the Allies, but its successor companies retained the research data, the patents, and the personnel. Several executives received prison sentences, but most served fewer than 10 years. Some returned to executive positions in the restructured companies. The use of concentration camp prisoners in medical experiments was classified as a war crime, but the corporate infrastructure that facilitated and profited from it remained largely intact. The Soviet Union conducted what were called filtration camps for Soviet POWs and civilians who had been captured or lived under German occupation. When the Red Army liberated these individuals, they were not immediately sent home. They were detained in special NKVD camps, where they were interrogated, often tortured, and assessed for potential collaboration with the enemy. The assumption embedded in Soviet military doctrine was that any soldier who surrendered rather than fighting to the death was a traitor. Civilians who survived under occupation were suspected of collaboration simply for surviving. Those who were found guilty, often on the thinnest of evidence or after being coerced into false confessions, were sent to the Gulag labor camp system. Estimates suggest that over 5 million Soviet citizens were processed through filtration camps. Of those, at least 500,000 were sentenced to forced labor. Many others were executed or sent to punishment battalions where survival rates were minimal. The policy was not a bureaucratic accident. It was codified in Order No. 270, issued by Stalin in 1941, which stated that there were no Soviet prisoners of war, only traitors. The families of soldiers who were captured were often stripped of state rations and social benefits. The existence of the filtration system was not widely acknowledged in Soviet historical records, and many of the prisoners who survived were not officially rehabilitated until decades after Stalin's death. The United States Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force developed and implemented area bombing strategies designed to maximize civilian casualties in German and Japanese cities. The objective was not precision targeting of military infrastructure, but the destruction of worker housing, the creation of firestorms, and the degradation of civilian morale. This was articulated clearly in internal British memos. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris argued that destroying German cities would shorten the war by making it impossible for the civilian population to support industrial production. The bombing of Dresden in February 1945 killed an estimated 25,000 people, most of them civilians, in a city swollen with refugees fleeing the Eastern Front. There was no significant military target in Dresden at the time. The raid was conducted to demonstrate Allied air superiority and to create chaos in German logistics. The firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945 killed approximately 100,000 people in a single night, more than either of the atomic bombs dropped later that year. The bombs used were incendiaries, specifically chosen because Japanese cities were constructed largely of wood and paper. The strategy was to ignite fires that would spread uncontrollably. Bomber crews were briefed on the expected civilian casualties and told this was necessary to avoid a ground invasion that would cost Allied lives. After the war, the area bombing campaign was not prosecuted as a war crime because the victors do not prosecute themselves, and the legal framework of the time did not yet include clear prohibitions on targeting civilian populations during wartime. The international laws that later restricted such actions were written after 1945, partly in response to what had been done, but they were not applied retroactively. The Nazi government operated the T4 euthanasia program starting in 1939, which systematically murdered disabled children and adults deemed unworthy of life. The program had a budget, administrative offices, medical staff, and a process for selecting victims. Families of disabled children were encouraged to send them to special pediatric clinics where they would supposedly receive advanced care. The children were killed, usually by lethal injection or starvation, and the families were sent letters stating the child had died of pneumonia or some other natural cause. The program later expanded to adults in psychiatric institutions. Carbon monoxide gas chambers were constructed disguised as shower rooms, a method that would later be scaled up for use in the extermination camps. The program officially ended in 1941 after protests from religious leaders, but the killings continued informally throughout the war. An estimated 300,000 people were murdered under the program. The administrative experience gained in T4 directly informed the logistics of the Holocaust. Many of the personnel who worked in the euthanasia program were transferred to Operation Reinhard, the plan to exterminate the Jews of occupied Poland. The T4 program was legal under German law. It had been authorized by Hitler in a secret decree. The doctors who participated were not breaking the law as it existed in their country at the time. After the war, some were tried and convicted, but many others resumed medical practice, particularly in West Germany, where the government was reluctant to pursue prosecutions that would implicate too many members of the medical establishment. The Allies conducted extensive human radiation experiments during and immediately after the war. The Manhattan Project required data on how radiation exposure affected the human body, but ethical concerns made it difficult to gather this information through direct experimentation on healthy subjects. Instead, researchers used hospital patients, many of them poor, many of them black, many of them unaware they were part of an experiment. Patients were injected with plutonium without informed consent. Others were exposed to high levels of radiation to observe the progression of radiation sickness. The data collected was classified and used to establish safety guidelines for workers in the nuclear weapons program. Some of the experiments continued well into the Cold War. The government did not disclose the existence of these programs until the 1990s, when a presidential advisory committee investigated and released a report confirming that the experiments had occurred and that informed consent had not been obtained. Survivors and families of deceased subjects were offered financial compensation, but the amounts were small, and the process required extensive documentation that many families could not provide. The scientists who conducted the experiments were not prosecuted because the experiments, though unethical by modern standards, were not illegal under the laws in place at the time they were conducted. The Germans were not the only ones who used forced labor on a mass scale. The Soviet Union operated a system of gulag labor camps that predated the war and expanded dramatically during it. Prisoners, many of them political detainees or ethnic minorities accused of disloyalty, were used to mine coal, build railways, log forests, and work in factories under conditions that guaranteed high mortality rates. The labor was classified as re-education, a term that allowed the state to present the system as rehabilitative rather than punitive. Millions of people passed through the Gulag system during the war. The exact death toll is still debated, but estimates range from 1.5 million to well over 2 million deaths attributable to the combination of malnutrition, exposure, overwork, and disease. The system was economically essential to the Soviet war effort. Entire infrastructure projects depended on forced labor. The Gulag was not dismantled after the war. It continued to operate until Stalin's death in 1953, and even after reforms were introduced, forced labor camps persisted in some form until the collapse of the Soviet Union. The records of the Gulag system were partially opened after 1991, but many documents remain classified, and the full scope of the system's operation during the war has never been comprehensively catalogued in a single accessible archive. The United States military maintained bordellos, sometimes called comfort stations, for American troops in occupied France, Germany, Japan, and the Pacific Islands. These were not unofficial operations run by civilians outside the chain of command. In several documented cases, military authorities either directly managed or explicitly sanctioned the establishments. In post-war Japan, the Japanese government, under pressure from American occupation authorities concerned about the rape of Japanese civilians by American soldiers, established the Recreation and Amusement Association, which organized brothels staffed by Japanese women. American military police regulated these establishments, conducted health inspections, and ensured they remained accessible to U.S. personnel. Some women were coerced into prostitution through economic desperation or explicit threats. Others were told they were being hired for service jobs and only discovered the nature of the work after arrival. When the occupation authorities later shut down the RAA due to pressure from American religious groups and concern over venereal disease rates, many of the women had no alternative employment and were left destitute. The official U.S. military history of the occupation does not discuss the RAA in detail, and records of American military involvement in regulating prostitution in occupied territories were not included in the main archival collections made available to the public. The Polish Home Army, operating as part of the Allied resistance, conducted ethnic cleansing operations against Ukrainian civilians in the eastern territories during and after the war. The violence was motivated by long-standing ethnic tensions and competing territorial claims, but it occurred while Poland was officially an Allied nation. Villages were burned, families were murdered. The violence went both ways. with Ukrainian nationalist groups committing similar atrocities against Polish civilians, but the scale and systematization of some of the massacres met the criteria for crimes against humanity. The events were not prosecuted at Nuremberg or any other Allied tribunal. After the war, the Soviet Union annexed the disputed territories, and the violence was subsumed into the broader narrative of wartime suffering without specific accountability. The Polish and Ukrainian governments did not formally address the massacres in bilateral discussions until the 21st century, and even then, the statements were carefully worded to avoid legal implications. The British conducted what they referred to as deep interrogation techniques at the London Cage, a facility where high-value German prisoners were taken for questioning. The methods used included sleep deprivation, stress positions, prolonged isolation, threats of violence, and in some documented cases, actual physical abuse. The interrogations were conducted by British intelligence officers, and the information obtained was classified and used in ongoing operations. After the war, several German officers who had been held at the London Cage claimed they had been tortured. The British government denied the allegations and sealed the records. It was not until 2005 that some of the files were declassified, confirming that the methods used went beyond what was permissible under the Geneva Conventions. No British personnel were prosecuted. The techniques developed and refined at the London Cage influenced interrogation practices used by British forces in later conflicts, including during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. The American military government in occupied Germany operated a prison camp system for detained Germans that in some facilities replicated the conditions of the Nazi camps they had liberated. The camps at Remagen and other locations held hundreds of thousands of German POWs in open-air enclosures with inadequate shelter, insufficient food, and minimal medical care. The death rate in some camps was significant, though exact numbers remain disputed. Eisenhower had classified the prisoners as disarmed enemy forces rather than prisoners of war, a designation that technically exempted them from the full protections of the Geneva Conventions. This allowed the Allies to reduce rations and delay repatriation. Photographs and reports from the camps were suppressed, and journalists were restricted from visiting. The conditions were eventually improved after protests from the Red Cross and concern that the images, if they became public, would undermine the moral authority the Allies claimed in prosecuting German war crimes. Most of the prisoners were released by 1946, but some were held for years longer and used as labor in reconstruction projects. The French conducted widespread summary executions during the purge that followed liberation. An estimated 10,000 people, possibly more, were killed without trial in acts of vigilante justice against suspected collaborators. Women accused of relationships with German soldiers had their heads shaved and were paraded through the streets. Men accused of working with the Vichy government or the occupation authorities were shot. In some cases, the accusations were based on personal vendettas rather than actual collaboration. The French government, newly restored under de Gaulle, did not intervene to stop the killings immediately. There was an understanding that a period of violent score settling was inevitable and perhaps even necessary to restore a sense of justice. When the provisional government did eventually reassert control, it conducted official trials, but many of those trials were also summary in nature, with minimal evidence and predetermined outcomes. Approximately 1,500 people were executed after legal proceedings. The total number of extrajudicial killings has never been definitively established because many were not recorded, and bodies were disposed of without documentation. The Allies shipped German scientists to the United States and the Soviet Union under programs designed to capture technical expertise before the other side could. Operation Paperclip brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America, many of them former members of the Nazi Party, some of them directly involved in projects that used slave labor. Their Nazi affiliations were scrubbed from their records or ignored. They were given new identities, security clearances, and positions in American aerospace, weapons development, and intelligence programs. Werner von Braun, who had overseen the V-2 rocket program built with concentration camp labor at Mittelwerk, became a central figure in NASA and was celebrated as a hero of the American space program. The decision to recruit these men was justified as a Cold War necessity. If the Americans did not take them, the Soviets would. Morality was subordinated to strategic advantage. The program remained classified for decades. When it was finally disclosed, there was some public criticism, but by then many of the scientists had died, and their contributions to American technological superiority were too embedded to disavow. The Soviets conducted mass deportations of ethnic minorities from the Caucasus and Crimea, accusing entire populations of collective collaboration with the Germans. The Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Balkars and others were loaded into freight trains and sent to Central Asia and Siberia. The deportations were carried out by the NKVD with military precision. Entire villages were emptied in a single day. Those who resisted were shot. The conditions on the trains were brutal, with no food, water or sanitation. Many died en route. Those who survived were dumped in remote areas with no infrastructure and left to fend for themselves. The official Soviet record classified the deportations as necessary security measures. The deported populations were not allowed to return to their homelands until after Stalin's death, and even then, many found their villages had been destroyed or repopulated. The deportations were not acknowledged as a crime by the Soviet government during its existence. It was only after the collapse of the USSR that some of the successor states recognized the deportations as acts of ethnic persecution. The Americans tested chemical weapons, including mustard gas, on American soldiers without their informed consent. The tests were conducted at military facilities and aboard naval vessels. Soldiers were exposed to gas in controlled environments to observe the effects and to test protective equipment and decontamination procedures. Many of the test subjects were not told what chemicals they were being exposed to. Some were promised leave or other benefits in exchange for participation. Others were simply ordered to participate as part of their military duties. The effects included severe burns, respiratory damage, and long-term health problems. After the war, the test subjects were sworn to secrecy and threatened with legal consequences if they disclosed what had been done. The program was not declassified until the 1990s. Veterans who suffered health effects were denied benefits for decades because the government refused to acknowledge the tests had occurred. Compensation was eventually provided, but only after lawsuits and sustained advocacy. The Japanese conducted forced labor programs in occupied Korea, China, and Southeast Asia, compelling millions of civilians and prisoners of war to work in mines, factories, and construction projects under brutal conditions. Korean women and girls were coerced into sexual slavery in a system euphemistically called comfort women, organized by the Japanese military to provide sexual services to soldiers. The women were held in brothels near the front lines, subjected to repeated rape, and many did not survive the war. The Japanese government maintained after the war that the system had been run by private contractors and that the military was not directly responsible. This claim was contradicted by documents that surfaced decades later, showing that the military had organized, transported, and regulated the system. The Japanese government issued an official apology in 1993, but has resisted calls for direct compensation, arguing that post-war treaties settled all claims. The issue remains a source of diplomatic tension, and many surviving victims died without receiving acknowledgement or reparations. The Allies agreed at the Yalta Conference to the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens who had been captured by or fled to the West. This included not only Soviet POWs but also civilians, refugees, and even some people who had never been Soviet citizens but were from territories the Soviet Union claimed. The agreement, known as Operation Keelhaul, resulted in over 2 million people being forcibly returned to the Soviet Union, where many were executed or sent to the Gulag. British and American soldiers, some of whom were uncomfortable with the task, used force to load men, women and children onto trains and ships bound for Soviet territory. Some of the repatriated individuals committed suicide rather than return. The operation was kept quiet because it conflicted with the Western Allies' stated principles of freedom and self-determination. Churchill and Roosevelt knew what awaited the repatriated individuals, but agreed to the policy to maintain the alliance with Stalin. The full scope of Operation Keelhaul was not publicly acknowledged until decades after the war. The institutional apparatus that permitted these practices did not disappear when the fighting stopped. Soldiers went home, governments published victory narratives, and tribunals were convened to assign blame in ways that allowed the victors to avoid examining their own policies too closely. The documents were filed, the records were sealed, and the dead were buried without the accounting that might have prevented repetition. The war ended in 1945, not because the systems that enabled it were dismantled, but because one coalition achieved military dominance over the other. What was banned was not the capacity for institutional cruelty, but the specific branding of the defeated.